the mighty Radeon RX 6600, truly a gaming beast. Yeah, I know, I'm kidding, it's a low-end graphics card, but a good one at that. For just 200 euros you can get yourself some pretty good performance. Now, I've had this GPU for almost 3 years now, and I was wondering if I could get more juice out of it with overclocking. And so, my journey began to try and squeeze as much power as I possibly can for this 3 years old low-end GPU. It took a while, but I managed to get the boost clocks up to 2800 MHz and my memory clocks to 1900 MHz using the default timings, not the fast ones. This is while drawing around 20% more power, but a lot more heat, which I'm surprised a single fan sitting in my PC can handle. Anyway, I know what you came in here for, so let's get to the benchmarks. Starting with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the 2018 title scores 50 FPS on average in the built-in benchmark. This is at 1080p at the absolute highest settings without using FSR or frame generation, which are also not supported by the game. Now, just to stress test the card a little bit more, I wanted to up the resolution, and so at 160% resolution the average this time is 40, which would be playable, but the problem were the minimum FPS. They were at 14, which made for a very stuttering experience, and I will not recommend playing at these settings. And the 200% resolution made this even worse, with 27 frames per second average and a minimum FPS count of 7, which led to extreme stuttering. But overclocking my GPU benefited this game a lot. Now, at the same exact settings, at 100% resolution, I only gained 3 FPS on average, but 6 FPS on minimum, which at these low counts is really a lot. It made the experience a lot more stable, especially in 160% and 200% resolution. Now, the 200% resolution was still a bit stuttery, but still, the game was actually playable now. Now, I've actually discovered that the benchmarking tool for Black Myth Wukong is free on Steam and you can just download it, so even though I don't actually own the game, I can still benchmark my GPU with it. Obviously, don't expect the best of performances, but still, at 1080p, without FSR or frame generation, which I didn't want to use with these tests, even though the game does support it, at completely low settings, seeing about 62 frames average with a minimum of 43. Medium was a little bit less playable, but still a good experience. High averaged around 30 FPS, which would be playable, except for those 8 FPS minimum, which made the experience unbearable. And it's actually worse than the very high-end cinematic, though very high-end cinematic had, well, around 20 FPS at best on average, so I wouldn't recommend those either. Now, overclocking the GPU made this a lot better. Now, the low preset even seems a bit overkill. Averaging at around 70 FPS, it's an extremely enjoyable experience, but personally I will bump it up to at least medium, where you do get a sub 60 FPS, but still they are very stable. It's 53, so it's still very good. And then bumping the settings up to high now gives you an actually good and stable experience with 33 FPS minimum and 40 average. Very high and cinematic remain kind of unplayable, though the frame rate are still too low, but with a little bit of frame gen, FSR, or maybe tweaking the settings a little bit, you could get a very reasonable experience in this game. Now for the last game, we've got Satisfactory. The benchmark was done sitting idle in front of my factory and measuring the average FPS. With everything set to the maximum and global illumination off, I was able to get around 72 frames per second on average. Bumping the global illumination up to medium led to a 47 FPS average, but when it comes to global illumination high, it led to an 11 FPS average, which is really strange, and from the footage I could gather that maybe VRAM was the limit, because I could see VRAM skyrocketing up to almost constant 8 gigabytes, which is the amount that the card has, and I really wasn't expecting a VRAM bottleneck with this kind of GPU. Though this may not be completely true once we look at the overclocked statistics. Now, with the same highest settings and with global illumination off, I actually couldn't see any improvement, almost any improvement, with 1 FPS, which, you know, isn't the greatest. But already at global illumination medium we can get a 6 FPS improvement from 47 to 53, which is always nice. And now global illumination high actually became playable at 46 FPS average. It's a really good result. Now for synthetic benchmarks. These obviously aren't as accurate as games, but are way easier to benchmark and way more reliable than games. The Heaven benchmark is very old, and it's a very bad benchmark for any modern graphics card. But still, while the 6600 isn't old per se, it's still a low-end graphics card, so I felt that this benchmark could still lead to some interesting results. And it kind of did. Without overclocking, we got a 92 FPS average at 2300 points, but with the overclocking, that bumps up to 104 FPS average and 2600 points. A very nice increment. The superposition benchmark instead is using the same engine as Heaven, but it's much more difficult to run and can challenge some of the most powerful graphics card of our time, though there is a 4K. I'm still trying it at 1080p, though it is using the extreme preset. With this we got 30 FPS on average or 4000 points without overclocking the card. And with the overclock we got 33 FPS on average and 4400 points. Very good. Now we have to talk about a few more things. I also wanted to run Cinebench as part of our tests, but strangely enough, overclocking the card led to much worse Cinebench results, from somewhere in the neighborhood of 3000 points to 1500, like half the power for some reason. I think this is a problem with overclocking these kinds of GPUs, AMD GPUs, maybe specifically Radeon 2, because this problem actually appeared on a friend's PC, which we were overclocking, and that PC had a 6700. So that is really strange on the Cinebench side, and I couldn't really get an answer. If someone knows why this happened, please make sure to write a comment about it. Now for the conclusions. So, was overclocking worth it? Maybe. Now, as you could see from the benchmarks, there are real advantages. It's not just 1 or 2 FPS. Sometimes can bring some settings to unplayable or barely playable to enjoyable even. Now this a lot of times came in the form of more stability, less stuttery gameplay, higher 1% lows and stuff like that, which is always nice to see. But the normal improvements on the average frame rate were actually noticeable a lot of times and were very good. Now there were a few strange cases like Cinebench, but overall I didn't experience any problems. That said, there are also some downsides to overclocking. Obviously the card is running much hotter and I can feel it, but luckily it's winter and it's somewhat cold here, so if anything it's nice, though in the summer I may end up disabling the overclock because it gets really hot here. Aside from that, there's obviously noise, because the fans have to ramp up quite a bit more, but I mean, I've got air conditioning in my room, and even with the overclock the PC doesn't become louder than it, so I don't really care about it or notice it in any way. And so, personally, I would recommend you go out and learn how to overclock and overclock your own GPU. You might even get better results than I did, especially if you are willing to do a little bit more magic and maybe make the voltage higher, the power draw even higher to try and get higher clock while still being stable. So, as I said, it was a very fun experience and I've had a lot of fun doing it. But for today, this is it. I hope you have a fantastic evening or afternoon or morning at whichever time you're watching this video. And bye.